watching this film and hearing someone like Van Morrison, who is not known for being an effusive guy, say, this man's a genius. Hearing what Paul McCartney has to say, Keith Richards. So why do so many people, I think music lovers, in 2016 say, who is Bert Berns? And is this an attempt to answer that question?
Absolutely, and thank you all for being here today and for sharing this with us, and thanks to the festival and to Nick Patrick and the Ace Records guys who are here. And this has been an enormous effort that started decades ago, and really the Ace Records compilations are one of the first strikes in this whole effort. It's a long, long story, but I knew I would have to tell my dad's story, sort of all warts and all, if I was going to get him recognized for his musical legacy. Because aside from people like Mick Jagger and Ace Records and the sort of super like experts on this, no one knew and no one cared to know, and it was really an uphill battle. A book came out in 2014 with Joel Selvin, which was also a major sort of moment in the process. We knew that if we told his story in every media, we might just get him in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was really the goal of the film to get him into the Hall of Fame.
Why wasn't he there already?
Well, because he died 50 years ago this coming year, and that's a long time, and the sands of time buried his legacy. He didn't have a press agent that sort of worked him into the Lifetime Achievement Awards that all of his colleagues have rightfully received. And he left behind powerful enemies who I think had an interest in burying his legacy, or at least not shining a light on it. And so it makes sense to me that people know who sings the songs, and that's really who we celebrate mostly, are the great artists that sing the songs, and the people in the background don't normally get celebrated at that same level, and so that's also understandable. But my dad was arguably one of the greatest of the whole time. I make the argument that he was the greatest. Don't ask me why. But on this side, and I'm biased. But he was also the most obscure, and so those two things to me were a powerful force, a driving force for me and my sister and brother to tell his story and get him recognized.
So were you surprised when the Hall of Fame, I don't know how it happens, is it like the Nobels, a letter arrives on the mat somewhere? Were you surprised? As you say, there were powerful enemies. Did you not think maybe they'd continue to block his admission to the Hall of Fame?
I did think so. And, for the Lifetime Achievement Award, it's even less democratic than the other Rock and Roll Hall of Fame recipients. So, but we have very, very powerful friends and allies at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, starting with Stephen Van Zandt and
the
Paul
narrator
Schaefer.
Of this film.
Yeah, Stevie, who is like the perfect voice of God and Bert Berns in the film. So Stephen was, tremendously influential in making that happen. The documentary was incredibly influential in making that happen, because before we even screened it at the festivals, Stevie was allowed to show it to some of the people on the inside and say, you see, this guy's legacy is out of this world. You just can't even imagine it. It's so much that you have to tell it in a 450-page book or a 90-minute movie. And so I think the fact that the book came out and that we have a musical that's also going to Broadway next year, that was off Broadway in 2014, we made a lot of noise for my dad. And the film, I think, is going to have an enormous impact. There's a distribution deal announcing this week that's going to be an international sort of theatrical release coming in the spring. It's amazing that the Hall of Fame happened ahead of the musical going to Broadway and the documentary happening on a wider level. But that attests to, I think, my father's legacy, and also having good friends in high places.
Well, you can also say the stars aligned, but as the son of a man in a hurry, this was your first film. You didn't do this in a hurry. This is a lot of years of work on your part, making this film.
Yeah.
Maybe you'd like to tell us something about how that happened. It's a tall order to take on as a first-time director.
Yeah, and I knew that I couldn't do this unless I found, world-class filmmakers to help me make the film. And so it really, the whole thing started rewinding just in a nutshell. I went to college. I was always chasing this phantom of my father and trying, he said, my children will know me through my music. And he would say that to my mother as he was going to his grave. And she would always tell us that, and I didn't quite know what Twist and Shout and I Want Candy and Hang on Sloopy told me about my dad. But I was always curious, well, who this great man that I never knew. So I sort of did things that might connect with him and make him happy. He was a Zionist that was like shaking down people on Van Morrison's Brown-Eyed Girl Circle Line Cruise party for donations to the United Jewish Appeal. His Italian friends were emptying everybody's wallets for money for the Israeli war effort. And so I went to Israel and I joined the Israeli army after college, and I was a paratrooper in the Israeli army and fought in all the different combat zones there. And so those things connected me with my dad. And when I came back from several years in the military there, my sister said, we're getting the copyrights back. And that was a real wake-up call, and we didn't know it, that the copyrights would revert back to us in the United States because he died in the first term of copyright. It's kind of complicated, but all of a sudden we had to start a publishing company. And that's kind of where I realized, okay, I was going to have to do all these things to get him, recognized, and the book was the first thing. And Joel Selvin is the world's leading expert on my dad. And there's people like Rob Hughes. Is Rob here today?
Yes.
That's Rob. Oh my God, Rob! I just can't wait to hug and kiss you and talk to you about more about this. But there were these guys who made it happen, who pushed it. And then the book fell apart. The book went into litigation. It's a long story. We don't want to talk about that. But 10 years went by. I called Joel. I said, all right, you son of a bitch, I need you to give me this interview, that's going to make the film like that sort of world-class expert. And I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. I started shooting interviews. I just knew, I went and saw Freddie Scott with Wazzle. I saw him at a concert in New York, and I was just still dreaming about a documentary. And I met Freddie, and it was amazing. And then a few months later, he died. And so that really made me, I just thought, okay, I got to start shooting interviews with these people. And again, I found great people to set it up. And, I learned as I went, and I started editing. And I spent about 8 years doing interviews, editing a rough cut with no narration, always knowing that I had to get a great editor that was going to take what I did and hopefully do something on this level. And that's what Bob Sarles, my co-director, he really earned the credit of being co-director. He was so phenomenal, what he did with everything. He had the idea of having narration, and we sat around going, who should narrate the film? And I thought, well, Steven Van Zandt. So it was really like that's a long answer. I hope it makes sense. I'm sorry, it's convoluted. It's a lot.
Not at all. There's a really many heartrending moments in the film, but when Cassandra says, all the memories I have of my dad are someone else's, and at first you think, and you were not quite 3 years old when he passed.
Yeah.
You must feel sad that they're other people's memories, but you're collecting them. Did that help you build up a picture of your own father?
Absolutely, and that's also my line too. I don't have any memory of him, and all my memories are somebody else's. We really feel that way. But we were very unlucky that the greatest person I could have ever known died before I got to, let him sort of sprinkle a little of that on me and raise me as his son, and that's a tragedy. But I look at the glass half full too, that he left this enormous legacy and all these clues, and I was able to really get to know him through his music and actually bring him back to life on the living stage. That's a little tall order, but the musical, it was that when that actor goes on stage every night and the audience is in tears at the end of the musical, every performance, it's like we did bring him back to life on some level. And that's even his friends like Wazzle, and guys like that were like, yeah, you did it, that was good, you captured Boyd, So, it's still an ongoing process, and I'm still getting to know him. Right now somebody sent me a new photograph of him that I'd never seen recently, and that was just one step further towards getting closer with him. And I've become spiritual. I was one of these atheist Jews that didn't believe in God or any of that stuff, but the whole course of this process has made me a very, very spiritual person in a sort of animist way. And I feel like his spirit is here right now in the room with us. My hands are sweating, and that's what happens.
In terms of the picture that you were able to build up for yourself and family members and other people who knew and loved him, the stakes are pretty high when you're trying to present it to somebody like Wazzle or the other people around your family who knew him. So how did you know then when you got it? Because any person is very complex. Obviously your father was, but what was the touchstone, or what was the moment where you knew the picture was true? You had enough accounts?
Yeah, it was early on at New York Theater Workshop in the East Village when we started doing the musical. That was the first sort of moment of true validation like that. The musical almost started at the Donmar Warehouse. They were the first theater that threw its hat into the mix of developing this show, but they couldn't find an English director who could interpret this American, sort of story. That's what they said. And then New York Theater Workshop, where Once and Rent and great musicals like that were born, took us under their wing, and we were doing readings, reading off the book, and when we watched those first presentations, and I invited Jerry Ragavoy, who was a tough audience, and my father's sister, also a tough audience, and some of those kind of people, and they sat there at the end of the musical, they were crying so uncontrollably that we had to sort of just wait and for them to, regain their composure, and that's when I knew that we had done it. And those guys responded that way.
Talking about difficult moments, your mom's a pretty impressive woman, and obviously a very important music industry figure in her own right, going from a 22-year-old who met the love of her life to having real judgment about people in very difficult situations. I mean, what was your experience growing up with her? And you were behind the camera. You were there when you were talking to her about your father's passing. Maybe you could tell us something about that. That must have been tough.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. My mother is, the towering figure in our lives, all of us. I mean, she basically picked up after my dad died, and Van Morrison and Neil Diamond and all the artists left the label. She had a record company with no artists, but she discovered this young singer-songwriter out of Meridian, Mississippi by the name of Paul Davis, and Paul had a number of hits in the 70s, like I Go Crazy, and she discovered Peabo Bryson and had hits with Brick, and I mean, so there was a 10-year run where, my mother, I was still in awe of her. I mean, I never saw, anyone work so hard or have such success, and she was like, we'd have celebrate Father's Day with her and Mother's Day with her. She was that kind of great parent. And she was also the hardest interview for me to get. Like, people say, how hard was it to get Paul McCartney and Van Morrison? I said, well, it was a lot harder to get my mom to give me an interview. It's true. She held
Why?
out. I think because it was difficult for her to, sort of, I think, to relive this. I mean, it's painful. Yeah. She never, got over. She says, I'm still in love with a dead man. That's a line we decided not to put in the film because it sounded funny, but she did say that. And also because she's just tough, you see her, and she was always afraid that I was trying to sort of overemphasize the mob stuff, and she always wanted to, like, my father from that, and, like, when I was a little kid, and she'd, crawl into my bed in the middle of the night, a little tipsy, and she'd say, I never want you to think of your father as a gangster. Never wants you to think of your father as a gangster. And I was, 8 years old. Like, what is she talking about? So she was trying to protect us from this story, and I think she knew that I was going to get it out of her, and I did. And and I understand her impulse to protect, her husband and her children from this, incredible mob story, which I embrace to this day. I think, we Americans, we love. That's like cowboys and Indians and the Italian mob. It's like, this is our history. We love it, and we celebrate it in every kind of medium. And to me, it only makes my father's story richer that they loved him like that, and he loved them. And it was like they weren't really in business together until somebody came along and sort of stepped into it, with my dad, and then they found out the hard way who he knew. So my mom was protective, and still is. She never came and saw the show off Broadway. Everybody was like waiting for her to show up. When's your mom going to show up? When's she going to come? And she just never came. Now, Carole King didn't come to Beautiful for many months after it opened on Broadway, and for the same reason. I think it's it's difficult to see your life on that stage, and if you can imagine, it's much more difficult, I think, for my mother because my father dies in her arms at the end of the show. I'm sure you probably could figure that's how the musical ends, but and it's very, very, very moving, and it'll crush her when she has to see that. So.
Did you expect she was going to get up and walk off camera when you were talking to her?
No. That was, and that was something Bob, my co-director, found. It wasn't something I thought that would be useful for a documentary. But Bob said that's her last, her last word in the film. We're not going to have her come at the end and say something like, I'm in love with a dead man. She's just like, that's my interview, I'm out. And first time I saw it on the screen, I burst into tears. I was like, oh my God, it really worked. So yeah, but that was not planned.
We see a lot of people in this movie who loved your father, including, like Wazzle. Someone says kind of a little bit in love with your dad. Are you surprised? I don't think of that as great songwriting talents or great music men. You know, you expect a kind of, he's a wonderful guy, I love him, but not in the sense where people are talking with real palpable affection about someone who obviously wasn't a pushover. Did that surprise you?
Yes and no, because I also knew that that he had heart and soul. He had more heart and soul than anyone. That's why the mob guys loved him so much. You know, it wasn't that they just liked him because he was, you know, hanging out with, you know, famous people. It was like they just loved him. I mean, he I guess it's, you know, if you live your life knowing every day could be your last, how would you live your life? I think my dad is that inspirational example of somebody who would, you know, just live with as much heart and soul and make as great of impact as you could. And so they loved him, and he had that charisma of a Bill Clinton, of a, you know, sorry to get into politics, but, you know, he had that kind of charisma, which is very rare, and I've only seen it in a few people in my life. They're usually people like Keith Richards, you know, so he had that, and people were just attracted to him, and they loved him. And, you know, and he treated these artists, you see, like he treated them like equals. He respected them, whereas I don't know if every producer and songwriter had that same level of love and respect for the artist. A lot of them felt like another artist could come along and sing this song as good as the next one, and, you know, they were almost like vehicles for their work. Whereas my dad, who was a musician, who was a singer or aspiring singer, who you know, who he did all of it, and so he respected them, I think, on the same level as he would have wanted to be acknowledged and respected. And I think that, you know, hanging out in the penthouse on the night before the recording sessions was where, like somebody said, where the magic happened, because, you know, that's the kind of guy he was. He'd, you know, break out the stakes, he'd roll up some joints, tie sticks, they were called back then, and, you know, they'd drink and they'd stay up all night listening to 45s and trying to, you know, find out what moved this act or this artist, or, you know. And so when they got in the studio the next day, they felt like friends and they felt safe. And so that love, I think, translated, you know, to this day, that they still love him and miss him because he treated them with that kind of respect.
In an era when, as it was pointed out, it was unusual for artists to go to someone's home, even more so if you were a black man being invited into a powerful white man's home. There didn't seem to be much sense on the part of your father that there were music men in the era where black artists were hugely important, but they were not perhaps treated in the same way that white artists were. Would you say? I mean, it was an era where it was very difficult. Yeah. I think.
In some ways, it was like a golden era, and especially in New York, there, where all the barriers were, you know, just laid to waste, and they worked together, everybody, and it was, you know, it was Italians and Jews and blacks and whites and this and that. It was like everybody working together, and my dad really was, you know, totally colorblind, and to the point where he only really wanted to make records, I think, with you know, with African American artists. It was almost accidental when, like, the McCoys would come along, or, you know, and Van Morrison, who is really, you know, I mean, like, blue-eyed soul music anyways, but, like, you see the vast majority of my father's work were with you know, R&B groups and soul acts, and that was where his heart was at. And he really almost, I think, if I could ask him, I would say, you know, that was really your exclusive focus. You know, it was like really making that kind of music, and, you know, he got away from it with the Neil Diamond stuff and the other pop things that happened at Bang. But, you know, 90% of his work, right, guys, is you know, really with you know, the great, you know, African American artists that came out of the blues and, you know, R&B and soul. So.
Just wanted to return to the mob issue, because obviously when we think of what interests press, media, a good selling line, you have to think of this as a film director. Of course, it catches people's attention, but and you say rightly that it is an interesting story. It's an American story, but is your father's connection, say, to these shady characters unique? Would you say, or
yes
actually?
And no. Yeah, yes and no. That's a great question. And Joel Selvin taught me this a long time ago. He said the mob were everywhere in the business back then. You know, like, you couldn't really go very far without brushing up against those guys in some way, shape, or form. You know, they sold the jukeboxes and the cigarette machines and the clubs, and it started there. And, you know, so they were there. And, you know, Morris Levy had an exceptional relationship with the mob in the music business. He really was the front end of the mob in the music business. You know, so he was more gangster than music guy, I think, you know, and people, you know, rightfully feared him. And my dad never worked with Morris Levy. He stayed clear from him. I think they did one record on Roulette Records, it was the Exciters song, but other than that, there was really no contact. But yes, my dad was the most mobbed up guy in that whole time and place, on a level of Frank Sinatra, and I think, I don't know that much about Frank Sinatra. I think they probably were in business together on some levels, whereas my dad really wasn't in business with these guys. It was, we could never find any proof of sort of that they shared any part of any business or company. It was strictly social. It's like my mom says, I didn't know it was a hood joint, and she clearly knew it was a hood joint, but I think because you don't even know the word hood joint unless you're but his friendship with Tommy, which again, really did come right out of their boats were docked next to each other at the 79th Street boat basin, and they just became friends, and no one really knew. They really knew my dad was friends with Wazzle because they were inseparable, but nobody knew about Tommy. And Tommy was, Tommy is legendary, even after he became the head of the Genovese mob, he was still, going out and pulling triggers and taking care of business, personally. And there's a lot of stories that are going to go into the DVD extras, tons of them, of Wazzle, feeding the dogs till the dogs started licking their hands, and then they'd go over the fence and smash up the bootleggers, and and they were going out there with baseball bats and taking care of business, in a sort of Robin Hood style way. And my dad loved that, and those guys loved him, and so. Yeah, he's easily, there's no second place to the connections between the mafia and my father in the record business in that time and place, except for maybe Frank Sinatra.
Were you afraid of what you were going to find out then in this process of discovery? Something that would, you say you're a spiritual person, at what point does it stop being lovely Wazzle who's crying as he listens to these great records but also hangs people out windows? Were you afraid you would get to a certain point where you would hear something about your dad and think, I can't admire him anymore because of, what he might have done?
That's another great question. It's for me, it's like, 'cause, my dad can do no fault. I'm almost like that place where, I'm so biased that if unless you walked out in the street and shot a person like Donald Trump wants to do, it's like that I would not, I don't think there's anything I could learn that would really, shock me to the point where I would go, wow. But what helped me as a filmmaker to be honest in telling this story. Was to tell the other side and throw my dad on the sword at times because he, it was over the top to bring Tommy Everly to the meeting with Neil Diamond. I think any reasonable person would probably agree with that, right? But then we look at the story, we see, well, why did he do that? It was the end. His time was really coming short. He knew it. He was having repeated cardiac events. We couldn't tell them all in the story of the film, but one time he had to pull over on the side of the road with Brooks Arthur in the Jaguar and start breathing into a paper bag in the Valsalvo method because it was coming down. They could hear his heart actually gurgling and stuff, and so it was out of control, and he was racing against time to protect his legacy, his family. He had 3 children under the age of 3, and and all sleeping in one room. He was imagine that kind of kinetic force that was creating labels and having a family, and there was just. So I'm sorry, I think I went off on another tangent and didn't answer the question properly.
Well, as a filmmaker, so the narrative arc of this story, inevitably, there's a point at which it turns to dark. It can't help but be that a man who died when he wasn't even in middle age, and maybe his best work was ahead of him. How did you deal with that? That's something that is meant to be the celebration of his legacy, but inevitably you have to start telling a sad and difficult story.
Yeah. No, that was part of what happened with the book. Actually, the book, Joel started writing this book, and he said, I'm having a hard time finding a happy ending to the story, of our hero. It's because it does sort of start to crash and burn at the end. And the way I look at it, and maybe this isn't really explained properly in the film, but I look at it like my dad was running, on one of those wheels, running and running his whole life, trying to make it. Every success increased the chances that somebody was going to come after him and try to destroy him, which happened. And, I look at it like once he got that money from the cotillion guys, and once they backed down, I think it was, again, was that overkill? Probably. But he got it. He got off the wheel. My younger brother was born 2 weeks before he died. You know, he had hits on the charts. He wrote "Heart Be Still" and "Piece of My Heart" in the last days of his life. You know, his last 2 records that came out. And I look at it like he won. He died a happy man, fulfilled, and having accomplished everything that he could have set out to do. So I feel like it's a sad ending, it's a tragic ending, but it's also a happy ending.
And the records live on.
And the records live on.
Would anyone like to ask any questions? We haven't got a microphone, but there's a hand right there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Really great film.
Thank
And a
you.
really great sound. And a lot of stuff I didn't know. And congratulations on getting interviews of so many people that have now passed on, which is quite incredible. But did you, I guess Wexler's quote at the beginning sums it up for him, but did you make any attempt to approach him?
Yes, I did. Thank you. It's
Your
it was
godfather,
my
Jerry
godfather.
Wexler.
Yeah, he was like I was the firstborn son, and that's how close they were. That I got, he was my godfather, and I grew up hearing those stories as well. But I never knew like all this other stuff. My mother never told me, and so when I came out of the Army, she put me up to calling him to see if maybe like he could help me get a job in the record business. I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, kind of thing. I was thinking of going back to Israel to continue as an officer and all this stuff. But then when the copyright started coming back, and we had to sort of focus on, minding the business. She said, "Give Jerry a call, and he's your godfather, and maybe see what happens." So I called him up, and he was very kind and very gracious, and he thanked me for calling him, and he said, "Well, it sounds like you don't know what happened between your dad and I at the end of days there." And I just could feel the blood rushing out of my head as he was saying this. And he said, "Why don't you go to your mom and find out what happened, and if you still want to meet with me, then give me a call." And I was like, "Thank you very much." I couldn't wait to hang up the phone and go out and smoke a cigarette. And so to his great credit, he did. He was honest with me, and he invited me to come back. And to my discredit, I would suppose, maybe it was because it took so much time for me to dig up this story and realize what he was talking about, that in those interim years, and then he died, and I didn't have the chance to do that. So I did meet with Amit a couple times, and Amit was also very kind and very gracious with us. We were going in there just to try to get him to fix our royalties, because the Bert wasn't getting paid properly as a producer at Atlantic. Long story, but so I got to meet Amit, and he was the irony of my dad getting the Amit Erdogan Award, right, is one of the great ironies of our lives. But yeah, I hope we portray Jerry as hero as well as minor victim, and however you not victim, a villain. He's the hero in my dad's life. He was the one who gave him that huge leg up and brought him into Atlantic. And Bert Berns was the staff producer at Atlantic Records after Lieber and Stoller, and that says it all to me. Of who he was and how, and he was the only outsider they ever created a label with Bang Records. So there was a lot of love there, and to be the best man at the wedding, and godfather of the firstborn son, and one of the stories that we don't tell in the film, but I wish we had, maybe we still have a chance to do it, is that the phone rang. My mother tells this story that when my dad laid down to take that nap, the phone rang, and she goes, "It's Jerry," and she goes in and says, "Bert, it's Wexler. You want to take this call?" And he said, "Just tell him I'll call him back. I'm taking a nap." And he died. Now, we always ask ourselves, why was Jerry calling? Well, my mom said, he's probably calling to book the next Barbara Lewis session. Whatever happened with this, they would have gotten over it. I think there's more to the story that I'm willing to even talk about still. I feel like I've discovered some little clues out there that I may want to reveal later, that I feel like are better to left untouched. But yeah, the fact that Jerry Wexler called him on the day that he died, probably to, right, guys, to book a session. Rob and Mick would know, that's the kind of guy Jerry was. It's like, okay, let's get over it. Well, we can make, Barbara Lewis has to keep going, Atlantic is hot, I imagine they would have kept working together and probably ended up getting over this and being friends.
Anyone else? Please.
Well, you basically answered my main question, which was that having made this fantastic thing about your father, that the other person who I knew of from being a teenager was Jerry Ragavoy, and much of what you say about your father and his talent making music and working with those artists would equally apply to, and so that was that question. I was a teenager in the 60s. I was aware of your father's name and his songs from a very early age. I bought all those records from A Little Bit of Soap On and the Songbirds and all the rest of it back in the 60s as they came out, most of them. And I was the guy who read the credits, so I was well aware of who he was, but fascinated also to know of his present thing. But of course, America was, it was like being on Mars or something as far as people in England were concerned. I could never have imagined being in a room this close to you, for example. And it was just not in my imagination that it was just like another planet. But instead of studying chemistry, I could tell you the catalogue numbers of every record, the writers. At age 16, I could tell you that I could recite the artist name, you know what I mean. And Bert Russell and Bert Berns were major features of my teens.
I always loved this about England and about the British. I married an English woman. I have 3 half English kids. That I'd come here and I'd go through record stores and look, for 45s before eBay came along, and I was able to find everything. And I countless times I would meet people, strangers who would say, Berns. Are you related to Bert Berns? I mean, that never happened in the United States, not once to this day. But here, it happened all the time. And so, I'm thankful, really to you guys for helping keeping this legacy alive, too, the way it was, because if it wasn't for Ace Records, and it wasn't for Rob Hughes, and it wasn't for people here who, kind of paid attention to those things, I don't know if we would have been able to have done what we did even here. I mean, maybe it's an exaggeration, but it was the long link, I think, happened here. And if it was up to my people in America, we would have forgotten about this and never looked at it again. So, Jerry Ragavoy, I mean, I hate to say this because it's sort of so tragic, but he had a stroke during the interview and went to the hospital and died. So, Jerry was a father figure to me, and I wanted him in the film. Of course, I couldn't have made this documentary without him. And he was the first person I interviewed, and I didn't know what I was doing. We had a little camera set up on 3 sticks, and it was no lighting, and it was all, and once we started to get it together, and we realized, okay, you need 2 cameras, and it's lighting and this and sound. I went back to him. I said, I need you to give me that interview again, and I want you to tell me this one story about, because he said, there's one story I'm not going to tell on camera. I was like, well, what is that? So at the end, I went to your dad's office, and he opened the drawer, and he pulled out a .38 caliber revolver, and he slammed it on the desk, and he goes, you know what that is? And Jerry was shocked, and he says, that's power. And I said, well, God, Jerry, you got to tell us that story when I interview you again, because this is the film we're making, And he didn't want to do it, but he agreed to, and we sat there in the bitter end on the same day with Andrew Loog Oldham. And Jerry sat there and played that little bit of Piece of My Heart. And I mean, we got, he gave us the interview I needed for the film, and I didn't know it, but he was having a headache, and he was talking about pain in his eyes, and he went to the hospital and died 2 days later. Never came out of the hospital. So that was his last great gift to us and the world and this film, and I'm going to get him in the Rock&roll Hall of Fame. Me and Steven Van Zandt.
You got form. Thank you so much for joining us.